no, 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 no! Ah!
Welcome, my fellow degenerates, to my inaugural episode of Anthology, where I'll be periodically taking a look at episodes or segments of anthology horror that I think deserve more attention, or I just have something to say about. I feel like individual episodes fly under the radar and don't get the recognition they deserve. You always hear about people talk about the shows in their entirety, how much they enjoy Tales from the Crypt or Tales from the Dark Side, but never really specific episodes. In my experience, many of these episodes are fantastic, and the storylines and concepts rival those of big budget releases or even celebrated horror films. Anyway, I love anthology horror. It's one of my passions. Whether it's a book, movie, TV series, or even in comic books, I always enjoy them. One of my personal favorites, and I'm sure a lot of other people's too, is Tales from the Crypt. I remember being a kid, you could only watch it if you had a subscription to HBO, which back then, you only had if you had a lot of money. My family didn't. However, my grandmother did. So, whenever we went to her place, she would just leave HBO on 24/7, no matter what was playing. Except after hours, at least I'm assuming. The first time I saw Misery, actually, was on HBO, at my grandmother's house. I couldn't have been more than 10 or so at the time. The adults would always be in the kitchen, talking and smoking or whatever, and us kids were just left sitting in the living room with a box of toys that looked like they were from the 1950s. Not to mention the fact that they were probably made for toddlers. Anyway, that left me with the option of either playing with the toddler toys or watching HBO for hours on end. I did what I think any 10-year-old would do. Pick HBO. It was one of the first cable networks that would go absolutely uncensored. It had all the blood, guts, and nudity you could want, and it was all blasted straight into your impressionable preteen eyeballs. For some reason, though, Tales from the Crypt was a no-no for them. I guess it was okay to watch Kathy Bates break James Caan's ankles with a sledgehammer, but as soon as the Crypt Keeper laughed, then it was time to turn the TV off. Figure that one out. Anyway, I did manage to catch a few episodes here and there when they were feeling especially negligent. And I loved that show even back then, just as much as I love it now. I have a copy of the entire series, and it often gets played in my house. A few episodes are even seasonal and must be watched around holiday time. One of the episodes that always stuck out to me was Carry on Death, which is the second episode of the third season of Tales from the Crypt. This episode is pretty minimal in story and in characters, but it still does a fantastic job of staying entertaining, and it keeps you engaged. It's about a criminal who escapes from prison and robs a bank with the intention of heading to Mexico to live the easy life. But a police officer catches up to him and cuffs the criminal to his wrist. So at this point, the burglar shoots the cop, and the cop, in one last big F you to the criminal, decides to swallow the handcuff key right before he dies from the gunshot wound, which leaves the criminal handcuffed to his heavy body in the middle of the desert, and the criminal at this point has no choice but to keep pushing towards Mexico, dragging this dead body along with him. There's really only two central characters in the episode, but the carry-on birds in the desert are pretty much characters in their own way. The criminal is played by Kyle MacLachlan, who I mostly know from Twin Peaks, and the police officer, or rather the corpse of the officer, is played by George Del. I think I'm pronouncing that right. He's mostly known for his work on Days of Our Lives, which is something I'm not familiar with. But Kyle MacLachlan pretty much puts on a one-man show here, and he does a good job of carrying the whole episode on his back. He fills most of the time walking through the desert by talking to the corpse, and sometimes bitching it out for being heavy, or sometimes just having imaginary arguments back and forth with it. MacLachlan manages to play this part in a way that's funny, charming, and he manages to get you on his good side, even if he is a murderous robbing criminal. Everything in this episode is pretty well done considering how low the budget is, though there's a few times when it's pretty obvious that he's packing around a prop dummy and not a person. It's not really noticeable, and it's not really enough to break your immersion unless you're watching too hard for it. This episode, like many episodes of Tales from the Crypt, feels like a cartoon in the best way imaginable. The spinning arrow sign right here is a comedy beat that's been done to death on shows like Looney Tunes. And his fall off the cliff here always manages to get a giggle out of me too. Everything just looks so exaggerated. It all leads up to a satisfying conclusion that even if you see it coming, it still manages to make you cringe uncomfortably. The end of this episode is surprisingly filled with body horror, and body horror is something that never fails to get a reaction out of me. I think it's because you can physically empathize with what they're going through on screen. I don't know what it is, but it's pretty effective. Anyway, this is one of my favorite episodes of the series, and it absolutely holds up today. As a matter of fact, it's on the top of many best of episode lists for Tales from the Crypt. In my opinion, this episode kind of encompasses what the whole series is about. It's funny and it's exaggerated, but it's still kind of gory, horrific, and gross, and it still tells a moral story. Anyway, check this one out if you can. The whole series is great, but this episode specifically is a must-watch.